Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to one more webinar in the webinar series that is put together here by the Beef Reproduction Task Force. Before we get started here, I just wanted to have a couple of announcements. So the first one is the ARSPC meeting. It's scheduled now for September 4th and 5th. We're going to be hosting the Applied Reproductive Strategies for Beef Cattle meeting in Athens, Georgia. So we're looking forward to having you guys attending the meeting. So please put that in your schedules. Also, before we get started, I want to also thank our diamond sponsors, Merck and Astrotech. Because of their support, we're able to host these meetings for free and provide a lot of useful, good information to producers and industry once a month. So stay tuned for the webinars as well. And also keep in mind that everything that we're presenting here in the webinars is also being recorded. Okay, so we're recording these webinars and posting them in our YouTube channel. So if you missed one webinar was not able to watch it live, please go to our YouTube channel and take advantage of those webinars there, because there's some pretty good useful information there. Another housekeeping statement here is the Q&A tab. So if you have any questions, please add those, not in the chat box, but actually in the Q&A, okay? And we're gonna try to address all these questions towards the end of the webinar today, okay? If you notice, there's a few messages going around in the chat, so if you'd please let us know where you're from and where you're connecting from. That would be great, so we can have an idea on where everybody's from. We've been getting a pretty good turnout in these webinar series, so it's nice to hear where you're coming from and where you're listening these webinars, watching these webinars from. So if you'd please enter that would be great. Okay. So without further ado, I'm gonna introduce our speaker for the webinar tonight. This evening is Dr. Sandy Johnson with Kansas State University. And she's going to be talking about the influence of protein on reproductive performance. So with that, Dr. Johnson, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, I was trying to get my audio unmuted, and if I can know that you're hearing me all right, that would be helpful.
We can hear you just fine, and now we can see you as well.
All right. Let me get all these little details straight here. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you this evening. It's been just a beautiful day here in Western Kansas, and my guess is that if you're in Western Kansas, you might not quite be in the house yet because it has been so nice and you're trying to get things done. But our focus this evening is going to be talking about protein and reproductive performance. And typically we are talking about protein and energy, say during gestation. We want to make sure those cows are in adequate body condition at calving and have enough energy for lactation and to be able to start cycling again. And because most of our beef systems tend to align that breeding season with some of the native forages, oftentimes then we're not as concerned about the quality of that diet once we start going to pasture. But today our focus is really going to be about the amount of protein in diets around the time of breeding. And, you know, in cases when we don't have a lot of information on the beef side, if there's something on the dairy side, we often say, well, surely if it works that way in the dairy side, it'll work that way in the beef side. And probably there's some things that's true, and there's others where it may not be. And in this case, as we talk about protein around the time of breeding and that level, there's certainly a lot more data on the dairy side than there is on the beef side. So we're going to explore that a little bit, some of the data that's in both beef and dairy. By no way is this a complete review, but to try to give you a sense of what's there. And then I want to share a little work that we've done in Western Kansas to try and address this. All right, so if we think about our beef systems, oftentimes with cows, one of our main goals to make sure we have at least 7% crude protein in the diet, because that's when we know we've got enough protein to essentially keep the rumen factory going, all right? And in general, because of the cost of protein, we probably lean more to the not feeding enough than feeding too much. However, there's been times based on the availability and cost of certain ingredients when overfeeding protein has actually been economical. And that's when the price of various distillers products are very attractive and more energy is needed in a diet, and we can get both protein and energy with a distiller's product. And so that's a case where sometimes we have overfed protein, and if we happen to be combining that with, say, alfalfa in our forage, we can easily get to fairly high crude protein levels in that diet based on the particular resources in the situation. Now, the other case where we might have excess protein in the diet would be if we're grazing some type of lush forage. And that could be spring or fall breeding, but we know that immature forages have higher crude protein, and as those plants mature, the protein levels decrease. So whether it's a cereal grain or some mixture of things that people might put in the category of cover crops, or even some of our spring forages, cool season forages, perhaps I should say, might have higher levels of protein. So our goal today is to try and improve our understanding about protein levels prior to breeding in beef systems. And so as we start out, I want to start with the lactating dairy cow. And, you know, if that cow is going to produce milk, she needs a lot of protein because milk contains a lot of protein. So she needs a lot of protein in the diet. And we also see that a high quality forage, you know, we talk about dairy quality alfalfa, and that 22 to 24% crude protein level really makes a big difference in milk production of those cows. On the beef side, now, if we're not using that, usually it's grinding quality alfalfa that we might hear about. And if we go back prior to when fertility in dairy cows started to drop off from some of these very high levels of milk production, we started noticing that these high protein diets were associated with reduced fertility. So before we go on, I want to just talk a little bit about protein and kind of make sure we're talking the same language here. And so any particular feedstuff that cow is going to consume is going to contain protein in, it's going to contain nitrogen in multiple forms. One form is going to be degradable protein, and that would be protein that's going to break down in the rumen. Microbes are going to use that to multiply and ends up as microbial protein then as it goes through the system. And there's also a portion of that feed protein that would be undegradable. It passes through the rumen mostly unchanged, and some of that can be utilized as it moves down the digestive tract. So when we think about this rumen and what's going on there, think of bacteria or microbial protein as they're driving the factory, and the factory is the rumen, and they're going to use the nitrogen that comes from this degradable protein, or in some cases there is non-protein nitrogen, and that could be DNA or other sources, but not protein in amino acid form. And the bacteria, microbial protein, is going to say, all right, I want to take this nitrogen source, and based on the energy source in the diet, I'm going to make the proteins that I need to live. And so it needs nitrogen and it needs an energy source, and the energy is going to be the carbon to make those things. Now, when the balance between the carbon and the nitrogen don't fit what the bacteria want, we can have some of that nitrogen leave the rumen. It can be absorbed into the bloodstream, also passes into the saliva, and that's a beneficial thing when we think about recycling nitrogen in our beef cows, and we want to take advantage of that. And it's in the bloodstream then, if the levels are very high, the liver is going to say, well, I want to make sure that we don't have too much of this nitrogen around, and we're going to work to get rid of some of it. Some of it will go out in the urine. And when the liver really has to crank up the job of getting rid of excess nitrogen, it needs more energy. So when we need to crank up that factory, it needs more energy. One of the ways that we can tell then what that balance is in a given animal is to measure the amount of urea nitrogen in either the milk or in the blood. So we'll be referring to blood urea nitrogen, or sometimes you'll see it referred to as plasma urea nitrogen, or that found in the milk, MUN, milk urea nitrogen. And that is kind of an indicator of the balance between protein and energy in the diet. Now, as I mentioned, there's a lot of data in the dairy side that relates to fertility and the level of protein in the diet. And one of the things that they have looked at was to essentially, I'm showing data from cows that were fed diets anywhere from 17 to 19.5% crude protein. And we said, if we break those into prior research that kind of looked at some of these break points, less than 19 milligrams per deciliter or greater than, what's the pregnancy rate of those? If they had lower levels of blood urea nitrogen, they had higher pregnancy rates than those that had higher levels of blood urea nitrogen. Now, keep in mind, this is cows essentially receiving the same diet. And the range of protein I gave you was how it varied over time based on resources. But essentially, they showed a nice difference then for cows that had these higher levels, indicating excess nitrogen in relation to what carbon was there or energy. In the same study, then they looked at these levels in the milk. And here we're breaking it down, not a tremendous a lot of cows here, but a fair number. And you see the pregnancy rates for less than 16 and 16 to essentially 19, fairly similar. And then we start to see a drop off with these higher levels of urea nitrogen in the milk. Now, if we try to find similar data on the beef side, we get to something like this. And this represents some work that Patrick Gunn did when he was at Iowa State, used some resources and data from, I think, South Dakota as well as Clay Center. And what they tried to do was, I think they had about data sets from 15 different studies, 1,300 cows, mostly cows, a few heifers, and they were on a given nutritional scheme for at least a week prior to when they were inseminated, and on that for the next 21 days. So they broke this down at various spots. So if we just look at this first line, what they did was said there's 116 cows. You may not be able to see all these numbers, but trust me, 186 cows with BUNs less than 10 milligrams per deciliter, and 1,118 that were over that. Okay, so they kept making each of those breaks and asked, if we break it above this and below this, do we have a difference in first service pregnancy rates? And if you just glance down there, there's only one p-value that's of much interest, and that's here at 16. And the p-value is 0.07. We might look at as a tendency. And contrary to what we might expect, though, the pregnancy rates, the first service pregnancy rates were higher in animals that had levels above that than below. Okay, and if we graph this in another way, you see this slightly upward trend in pregnancy risk, or the likelihood they might get pregnant, as this plasma urea nitrogen increases, but the relationship is not particularly strong. But what we don't see is a big negative impact as these levels increase. Now, one of the things that has been shown in a number of studies is that when we have this excess nitrogen in the system, it's impacting a number of other, it can absorb into the bloodstream. It's going to impact blood flow then to uterus, other things. So one of the things that has been shown is a decreased uterine pH around the time, after estrus, with a high protein diet. So if we start on the left-hand side, this is a study that looked at dairy heifers where they were trying to limit their intake of metabolizable energy to kind of try and make them like a high-producing dairy cow that's maybe in a negative energy balance at 2 levels of dietary protein. Notice they had a significant difference in the blood urea nitrogen, but not up to that level of 19 and above that we saw in some of that other work. The first service conception rate was significantly different, but notice there's only about 40 animals per treatment. And I think most of us, if we were breeding heifers and we got a 61% first service conception rate, well, while we might want more, that's not anything to complain about. So something to note. And so they monitored uterine pH both at estrus and day 7. And so during a normal estrus period, the uterine pH generally decreases from about 7 to 6, 7, 6, 8 following that, and then returns to 7 somewhat later. So we see this decrease around the time of estrus. Day 7, the normal quote unquote diet is back above 7, whereas it remains low in the high protein diet. And there are other studies then that have looked at oocyte development, embryo development, using this same type of model, and certainly there are negative effects seen, but not in 100% of the studies. It's a little hard to try and review all of those in this period of time, but just know that there's strong data to support this type of approach or this type of effect. If we go to beef heifers, this is a student of George Perry's, I believe, when he was in South Dakota. They have 60 heifers in each treatment. Now, their dietary protein was not as perhaps as high as what we saw in the dairy heifers. They did have enough difference to have significant difference between the BUN level. But when they looked at the uterine pH on day 7, they did not see any difference. And the pregnancy rates at 21 days following natural service were not different. They also collected oocytes and did not really see any differences on this level of protein in diet. Was it high enough? I don't know. But in this case, you see very similar responses. All right. Now, these next couple of studies I want to talk about, I think I always appreciate their design and what they were trying to get at, because two things. One, because they're using beef heifers and grazing something. It's like, well, that applies to us. That's great. And they were trying to get at the amount of energy in this diet when we have higher levels of protein. So what they did in a 2x2 arrangement, They used nitrogen fertilizer to make that ryegrass very high in protein. And I think the pastures that were fertilized with high levels of nitrogen were about 23% crude protein. And the low fertilization, and I think was actually none, was like 12 or, much lower. Okay, and so then to test the idea whether or not, okay, if we have enough energy in there, can we use up that protein and make everything fine? They provided a supplement in a fermentable carbohydrate, so something that would break down very quickly in the rumen and be available for that excess nitrogen. So what they saw was they were able to change essentially the amount of urea nitrogen in the blood, but there was no impact on embryo survival rate or development. And they actually sacrificed some of these heifers and measured some different characteristics of those embryos. And I think that was about 40 days. I can swear to that. But they did try to look at those embryos and see if they could detect any negative impacts. All right, so nothing really there. 71% embryo survival rate. Again, we would be happy with that level of fertility. Okay, in another study then, they tried to increase the amount of ruminally degraded protein by how they were supplementing. And then again, 2 levels of energy to provide more or less of a fermentable carbohydrate to use up that excess nitrogen. Embryo survival rate, 62%, very acceptable, and not influenced then by either the amount of urea or the carbohydrate in the diet, and nor could they find relationships then with these various measurements and any embryo survival rate. So pretty good numbers, grazing, forage like we might do, and no differences really in fertility. Now, another study that really gets at some of the, what from time to time, we have these anecdotal reports. Well, these heifers were bred on wheat pasture and we had lower levels of fertility. And so we automatically say, well, it's like the dairy cows, we have too high a protein and that caused a problem. And unfortunately, I don't know of any of those instances where I have any facts to go with those observations. There could be not enough pasture, the animals may or may not be in adequate condition. I really don't know. Should any of our listeners have some good information with a little complete observations to back it up in this type of situation, I would really love to hear from you to see what your experiences are. I know that we have a number of producers around here that are grazing triticale in fall breeding herds, but typically they're probably out of much forage by the time the breeding season starts. So to this study, this was in Oklahoma, and these heifers were started on treatment about 3 weeks prior to AI, and I think they just used prostaglandin at this time. And you see that this upper line is the dry lot group, and it shows the blood urea nitrogen. So the wheat pasture did result in higher levels of nitrogen in the blood. And because the other group came off of this wheat pasture into the dry lot, you see that change. If we go to more specifics, about 40 heifers in each treatment. The time of AI, the dry lot heifers outweighed the wheat pasture heifers, not by a lot, but significantly more. This seems a little bit maybe reversed, that the cyclicity would be improved in the wheat pasture heifers, although it's a tendency at 0.08. The AI pregnancy rate was not significantly different, and the numeric trend is certainly not a reduction on the wheat pasture, nor was the final pregnancy rate. So this doesn't quite follow what we might expect based on the dairy data. Now, another study that we did here in Kansas, the Ag Research Center in Hayes, Keith Harmony had recently started and wanted to look at grazing systems. And so we compared a grazing system that essentially one group was on native pasture through a summer grazing period, as might be fairly typical. And then another group had grazed wheat pasture from about April to June, depending on, forage growth and availability, and then went to wheat pasture, to native pasture. And so the wheat pasture, well, both groups would have been bred about the end of May. And so, the wheat pasture maturity would vary across the years, but certainly probably a higher protein than our native pastures, although we did not measure protein levels in those native pastures. So both groups were underwent fixed timed AI at the same date, but at their respective locations. And so our pregnancy rates look like this. In 2001, these were all first calf heifers, so we had a lower pregnancy rate as we might expect. So we do not have any significant effects of either year, treatment by year interaction, or an overall treatment effect. You see numerically the native is higher, but the statistics tell us that we didn't have enough evidence to detect differences. And so this has fairly good numbers, replication, did not see a significant difference, wasn't particularly designed to answer this question, but the data available allows us to look at that as I've shown you here. So, do high protein diets influence reproduction? Well, the dairy industry has generally accepted that, but the fact that many of these studies had fewer animals in them led individuals, and there's several different types of meta-analysis, and I know you can't read all this. What I want you to see is several things. Let me take you through this. Okay, each of these listings here is a different study, and there's about 30 of them there. And I think I can zoom in on this so you see that, each is a different reference. And notice then that we have all kinds of diets and how, the authors are trying to describe them here. So that's a challenge. What did they measure? Some cases we have clear first service pregnancy rates, different time points. So it's a challenge to try and put this together, but they put together what they could. And so of about the 30 studies here, if it's on this side of the line, that means that the response was such that there was either no difference or an improvement in pregnancy in high protein diets. And about 2/3 of these are on this side of the line that would show a negative impact of high protein diets on fertility. And they put a number of about a 9% pregnancy rate difference, and think of that on a first service conception basis in these high protein diets in dairy cows. There is one or two studies that include something with heifers that might be more like our beef cows. And I think there's maybe one or two that are more in a grazing situation. But one of the things you see in these reviews on the dairy side is they recognize that in grazing dairies in New Zealand or other areas, there is not the same problem with high protein impacting fertility. And we'd expect that there were high protein diets in those grazing dairies, at least at some given point in time. However, maybe the level of milk production is not the same. Body condition and the changes may not be the same. And so for me, that's kind of a lingering point in my mind, I don't know how to quite resolve for myself, is that grazing dairies, which in my mind would be closer to our beef cows than these high producing dairy cows in the United States, don't seem to follow the track of our high producing dairy cows here. So I believe there's a negative effect in dairy cows, but I'm not sure when and how it might translate to the beef side. So from here, I want to share some data then in a very practical situation done with a cooperating producer, looking at performance of heifers that were either developed in a dry lot or grazing triticale, which is a cool season cereal grain that many people are using. Okay, so we wanted to look at these two systems. We used the available feedstuffs that the producer had, and of course, over time, the amount of growth of the forage is going to vary. So it was, all real life. Now, the heifers at this operation, in most years, they were grazed as one group on kind of what was available. It might have been volunteer wheat or triticale, or it could be some native pasture with a little bit of supplementation. In one year, then we had to, they were divided into two groups to graze some separate fields of triticale, not enough forage to put them all in one place. And when this occurred, then we included that in our allocation to treatments to account for those differences. So our study looked like this. We bred heifers based on a 14-day CEDAR protocol and did a fixed timed AI. Based on the amount of moisture and growth of that triticale, as well as probably when the manager could negotiate all the things that had to get done, we started at various intervals prior to inserting that CEDAR. And so here you see this difference. So it's really the end of April when these heifers were being bred. The numbers varied quite a bit over time. In this first year, they did turn out bulls, natural service. After AI period, in the other years, just exposed one round of AI, and that was the heifers that they retained. So we tried to estimate cycling activity by looking at patch scores after the CEDAR was removed. If more than half of that patch was exposed on an Estrotec patch, we consider those to have been cycling. Also, body condition scored those. Did the same thing then at when we gave prostaglandin, put on another patch and monitored that estrus response and scored body condition again. And then we collected blood samples these two times through the chute to look at blood urea nitrogen. And we also, our weights that I'll show you for end of treatment is essentially an average of these two weights. All right, so important to include in this discussion is that the heifers that grazed triticale watered on native pasture that was adjoining all these fields. And so as that native pasture started to green up, they were, that was available to them. Do not have any data on how they spent time where. There were differences in moisture each year and what growth there was. Sorry, I need a little moisture there. So this is looking at the triticale content at the start of grazing and again at the time of AI. You see fairly high concentrations then in each of those years and a reduced level at the time of AI. as you look at these differences here, in 2017, we had a lot of moisture. We actually pulled heifers off the triticale several times to the point where we weren't even sure we could go ahead, but the beef-oriented people went out over the agronomists. We turned them out anyway, but because we weren't repeatedly grazing off that forage and using up a lot of the protein, that's probably why this protein is higher, even though this was in advanced maturity. You know, these years, as those plants were eaten off, it needed the additional nitrogen there to regrow, so the total amount in the plant looks somewhat less. Our stocking rates, we think, provided plenty of forage, but range from 1,300 pounds per acre this year when there was there was plenty, we didn't even touch the forage there, to 110 pounds per acre in 2020. So we were able to, we think we had plenty of forage there. And I think as you look at this other data, you will agree that we probably did. So the group that went in the dry lot, then we used their available forage. And you'll notice that I said we had a lot of growth in 2017. Well, we're still feeding that triticale silage that was put up in 2018. Typically using corn and either wet or dry distillers grains then for the protein and energy components. The heifers were further behind in 2020. So the higher crude protein maybe than what might be ideal was needed really to get these heifers moving along a little bit more. So what does that do for animal performance? We have the years, starting weights, really, as we would hope, there was no difference in starting weights of these heifers. Ending weights were heavier in the triticale group, and perhaps that's easier seen by looking at the average daily gain that were consistently higher for the triticale groups. And I indicated that this year the heifers were a little behind, and you see they're about 100 pounds lighter. They gained very well, probably getting a lot of compensatory gain there. But we'll look at what happened to their fertility here in a minute. So we were getting plenty of energy and what appear protein in the triticale group, and they outperformed the dry lot. And we knew we couldn't totally match up the gain in these two diets. We just wanted to make sure that we provided enough in the dry lot to try and get a good response, and hopefully the triticale would be similar. All right, let's look at body condition. At the time, we took the cedar out, and then at AI, we didn't score those heifers in 2017. Really not much difference between those groups at cedar removal. They hadn't been on their treatments very long in most cases. And then as we get to AI, you start to see a little more body condition in those triticale heifers that matched with the gain data. And maybe easier to look at that then is the body condition score change. Now, this scale is a little bit exaggerated here, but we put on about a half a body condition score more in the triticale group in this year. And overall, then that treatment effect was more positive body condition score change from the triticale heifers. All right, we scored EstrTech patches to estimate estrus response. So the 3 or greater would be those that we thought were in heat after cedar removal. Essentially, we're just going out there and reading those patches anywhere from 5 to 6 days after the cedar was removed. Really a similar number in 2017, 2018. There was no significant treatment effect, and the only significant effect was a year effect. So, roughly 80% of those that were catching in heat, with exception of this 2020, where we knew those were behind. And now we're looking at those that had an activated patch at the time of AI. No significant treatment effect, with some variation by year that you see here, but certainly not a consistent response in terms of estrus response prior to AI. This year, because of the low response, rather than that single fixed timed AI, we came back the second day and did a split time AI to try and get a few more of those heifers bred. But you'll see here that perhaps we weren't as smiling so well for that year. All right, what about blood parameters? This looks at blood urea nitrogen, either at the time that we gave prostaglandin or at insemination. You see a consistently higher level in the triticale heifers, significant treatment effect overall. Interesting that we had the level of variation from year to year. And when you think about, some of the other data I've shown you, these are really relatively low levels for both groups. And whether that's a function of, when those heifers had a drink last and maybe a little more, just had a big drink, and so it's more dilute than if they were more dehydrated. I'm not sure of that. Really a similar pattern at the time of insemination then, for an overall, treatment effect of higher blood urea nitrogen in the triticale group. Now, non-esterified fatty acids are something else that we looked at. And when the concentrations of non-esterified fatty acids are higher, relatively speaking, it's an indication of mobilization of fat stores to meet energy needs. So as we look at these, we get a tendency of a treatment effect at prostaglandin. We look at this overall effect, but the higher NEFA for the dry lot group would say that they were their energy situation was not as good, which actually agrees with the gain and performance data. And then the same thing true really shows up at the time of insemination. So energy shortage is not a problem in our triticale heifers. They should have, we don't have evidence that they're any different from the dry lot fed heifers in that regard. So bottom line, what was the AI pregnancy rate? First year when we had the largest number of heifers, virtually no difference. And then each subsequent year, we had lower pregnancy rates in the triticale group for an overall negative effect. So if we try to summarize this study, then we did see differences in urea nitrogen in those heifers that were grazing triticale that had higher protein compared to the dry lot diet. Those heifers were also heavier and in better body condition, but that did not translate into improved pregnancy rates. When we think about trying to flush heifers or, flush cows, clearly that last year we had increased gains, but certainly not enough to impact pregnancy rates. I want to just take a moment to recognize Black Diamond Angus in Spearville, Kansas was our cooperator, and we really appreciate their sticking with us because no, they weren't pleased with my triticale treatment heifer responses. Got product from Zoetis and Estrotech, which we really appreciate. And we're able to get some additional funds from the Ogallala Aquifer project is we're looking at trying to keep some of this soil covered during the off season, and that has been good for us to try and work with producers on that. All right, so as we try to put this all together then, and we look at the beef cows and the dairy cows, when are we comparing apples to apples, and when is it apples to oranges? I mean, that high producing dairy cow, the United States, a lot of milk production, needs that high quality diet. How does she differ from that grazing dairy cow in New Zealand, who would seem to be more like our beef cows? You know, the things that we have not done here is try to break down types of protein, types of energy that we're supplying. We could get into a lot of detail. I'm not sure it would necessarily help us understand things better, but you know, we're trying to look at big picture crude protein, but you know, there's a lot more to it. All these situations have different management issues, so that's a challenge for us. If I try to kind of weigh what I've seen as I look at this literature, it seems to me that there are fewer detrimental effects of high protein diets on the beef side than there are in the dairy. But that's I haven't figured out a good way to really tally that up and say, yeah. And there's not nearly the amount of data to do a meta-analysis like there is on the dairy side. And one of the things observed as we're doing this study, that first year when we had good moisture, the mature cows at that operation, essentially in 30 days, grazing triticavity, they changed one body condition score. And if that's in that situation, if we could get that many more cows cycling compared to, say, staying on another diet that was just going to maintain body condition or perhaps even go backwards as that cow increases milk production, would we really get more cows bred early, even though some of them might have lower conception rates, just by the virtue that we had more of them cycling? And so I think because this forage can have so much quality and provide that gain, I think we have to look at that very closely. And, you know, perhaps we limit the amount of time that cows are on it. You know, how can we take advantage of that and not be conservative on whether or not we might see detrimental effects? Then the other thing I would suggest to you, if you want to kind of get into more of this, is to look at Patrick Gunn's paper, Proceedings in our 2016 meeting. And one of the things I didn't get into is in his graduate work and work at Iowa State, he was interested in using some of these byproducts, distillers grains, gluten products, and when we fed higher amounts of those, what impacts do they have? And in many cases, they had very positive effects on follicular growth. And of course, I didn't want to go into that too far, because part of what that could be with the distillers, and I don't remember at what point they were taking more fat out of distillers on the years he was doing that, but you know, fat might also be a part of that picture. So a lot of moving parts. You know, I don't feel like I can draw a sound conclusion. Definitely high protein diets prior to breeding are going to reduce fertility in beef animals. Now, probably there's some points where, yes, you could be, I don't know how extreme it might be, but we know that excess nitrogen in the diet, talk about nitrate toxicity, there are points when too much is too much, but cows can adapt to nitrogen. And one of the things that we think about is how long the cows have been on a particular diet, what's their ability to adapt. And you know, these beef cows really have some abilities to adapt. And so I think we have to look carefully at our opportunities, and you've seen kind of what data there is on the beef side, and think about trying to manage those risks and the trade-offs. So at this point, I'll turn it back to Pedro to see if we have questions there, and what else we need to discuss.
All right. Thank you, Sandy. We got a few questions here. So just for those of you that were not, might not have been connected in the beginning of this webinar, please type your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to try to address as many questions as we can now. So we started addressing some of those. We typed some answers there, so you can find the answers there too. But yeah, Sandy, the first one that I have here is, did you measure dry matter content in the triticale?
We would have that. Of course, it's very high moisture. This is lush forage. It didn't include that there. And so were they getting enough dry matter? What was the rate of passage? Perhaps is what that's getting at. And the virtue that we had some native pasture, essentially access to that as they went to water, and the fact that the performance we have, I don't think enough dry matter was the issue in this case. And again, I think the dry matter content would be, probably 20 some percent, not more water than dry matter at that point.
Great, thank you. So the next one that I have here is whether you utilize the same sire in both groups, the triticale and feedlot group, and would you think that the genetics could play a role there too? And also, the same question is also asking the breed of the heifers and sire.
Yeah. So I should have mentioned these were primarily Angus based heifers, and in most years we use the same sire on all heifers. And if we used, I think a couple of years we used 2 sires, and we balanced those across those treatments. So sire differences can occur, but we're nowhere near to the maybe 800 observations to really make any judgments on sire data.
Okay, excellent. So another question would be, so do you think there's a difference in the magnitude of the levels of protein between the dairy studies and the beef studies?
Well,
and could that explain those differences?
So they've tried to include some of that in the meta-analysis and look at type of protein and whether it was degradable protein. I guess my answer is that as I've read that, I'm not ready to draw a conclusion. And part of it is my understanding of how they did the meta-analysis, and maybe I'm not smart enough in that statistics to be comfortable with it. But they've tried to pull some of those things out, but everybody did something different based on what they had, and that's, if 30 years ago we'd have said, well, okay, if you're going to do this is the way you should go about it. Well, that might have helped, but you got to use what you have, and that's a challenge as they try to put some of these together. And then the other thing is, based on what was reported in the paper, maybe they could include it or maybe they couldn't, because they need some measures of variability in those papers, and in some cases certain things weren't included certain times in history. So yeah, it's a challenging thing to try to get a handle on.
Absolutely. Now I got another question coming in. Would too much or too little protein cause abnormal presentations during calving from a
I'm
dystocia standpoint?
I'm not aware of any nutritional impacts on the presentations. I don't know if any of my colleagues have seen a data to that effect, but generally, if we don't have enough protein that the female's actually weak, okay, well, then yes, but I'm not sure that beyond that I can make any statements.
Okay, so the next one is when looking at protein utilization, sulfur supplementation is important to maximize intake. So, what do you think is the influence of sulfur on this?
Well, as you look at these data sets and their feed ingredients, again, they're all over the board. If they're feeding distillers grains, we probably have plenty of sulfur. There's other studies that have tried to look at adding specific amino acids to, say, well, we didn't have enough sulfur, so we couldn't make this amino acid. What if we add it directly? I don't think we're ready to draw a conclusion about that. And the little bit I've seen is that there hasn't been a lot of difference, but I've not tried to review that thoroughly. And I don't know if we have any of our more nutrition-based task force members on, but that would be as far as I can carry that conversation.
All right, thanks, Cindy. And I think that addresses all of the questions that we have here in the Q&A. So with that, I'll get ready to wrap everything up. So again, thanks, Cindy, for the presentation. And just remind everyone that we're gonna have more of these webinars next month as well. So stay tuned in our Facebook page, and we're gonna be advertising those there as well. Okay. So with that, we're gonna wrap it up, and we would like to thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next webinar. Thank you very much.